All right, there we go. Hey, everybody, welcome to another awesome episode of Afterlife Apologetics. Here we like to talk about deathbed visions, near death experiences, and of course, apologetics, how they all intermix together. Our goal is that you, the listeners, walk away informed on both the impact that near death experiences and deathbed visions are having on the overall worldview conversational stage. All right, so our hope for you is to walk away educated and knowing that these can be used as a line of evidence to come to the conclusion that Christianity is true. That is what we believe the evidence leads to. However, this podcast is absolutely dedicated to helping inform our viewers like you on why we think that, the lines of evidence we have to think that. And so our hope is that we engage you in a dialogue, we engage you guys in a way where you're thinking and you're communicating with us, whether you agree, whether you disagree, whatever it is. Our goal is to further the conversation around these crazy phenomena, what they have to offer us in terms of information about the reality that we live in. So we began last week by overviewing the lines of evidence for deathbed experiences. And we went through two particular lines of evidence. I'm going to review those very quickly for those who may not have heard last week's. Go back to last week's episode 18, in order to get your hands on a much more in-depth conversation around these two particular topics. I'm going to just quickly review them for us. So line one was the ability to influence our time of death by solely mental means seems unlikely given a naturalist, materialistic, physical theory of the brain. So what this is saying is, if naturalism is true, then why should we be able to influence when we die? Why should we be able to change the time and the date of our death? And Steve gave the examples of two of the founding fathers and their ability to keep themselves alive until a particular date of personal significance to them, which was obviously the birthday of the country. And then they passed on both at the same time frame. So if naturalism were true, how could we influence the time at which we die? Okay, that's the first line of evidence. Line of evidence number two is, under naturalism, how could we know we are dying without sufficient physical predictors of death? And so within this line of evidence, it's essentially to say, how do people know when and where they're going to die without any physical predictors giving them signs of that? Like they'll say, I'm going to die tomorrow. And they could be a completely healthy individual, and then lo and behold, they die tomorrow. So it's almost like there's a supernatural knowledge coming to the person, which is telling them their death is coming very, very soon. And we see this demonstrated. We gave a story about 4-year-olds, two 4-year-old stories, totally different from one another. However, telling their stories of maybe informing their mother, hey, I'm gonna go to heaven tomorrow, and it's going to be a great place. Don't worry about me. And then the mother, says, don't say things like that. And then the daughter goes the next day and dies, confirming that she did in fact know exactly when she was going to die. So these are instances around the deathbed experiences that they leave you puzzled and wondering, well, what exactly does that mean? And so those are the two lines of evidence we went through last week. Like I said, just a quick flyby. But if you guys want to go further in depth, and here Steve and I discussed this in great detail, go to last week's episode, because today we're going to be moving into the next line of evidence. And with that, I will hand it over to Steve.
So if you've got a 4-year-old, keep an eye on them. From that, like what we learned from that last chapter, I was at a 4-year-old birthday over the weekend, so keep an eye on those 4-year-olds. But take seriously things they say. Sometimes children know things that we may not give them credit for. So listen to those youngins. Sometimes they've got something to say that's important. So this is a cumulative case. We're just like in a court of law, you'll have a cumulative case against someone to show who's the murderer or prove that a person is innocent. So we're giving a cumulative case that these experiences are truly spiritual in nature, rather than just being explainable by naturalistic means. I have 11 lines of evidence. We've dealt with 2 of them so far, and these are regarding deathbed experiences, not near-death experiences, but deathbed experiences whereby people are on their deathbeds, or people are having visions of people on their deathbeds, things surrounding death. So dealing with number 3, and we may not get past number 3 or even through it this time, because there really is a lot to consider. And that's why I appreciate these 45-minute, hour-long discussions because you just can't deal with these things in depth in a 1-hour interview. But line of evidence number 3 is this: naturalism indicates that people should not be able to have accurate premonitions of the deaths of others. Okay, so this is people who are not dying. In other words, when people say, oh, near death and deathbed experiences, those are just symptoms of a dying brain. They're lacking oxygen, they're having hallucinations, their brain's going haywire. Therefore, that explains it all. This line of evidence is people who are not dying, but they have visions of other people who are dying, and we want to examine those, starting with some spectacular examples. Um, Mark Twain, pen name for Samuel Clemens, famous writer in American history. He was also not very spiritually minded in many ways. He often cut down the church, Christianity in particular. So it's kind of unusual that on this one point in his autobiography, he tells about an experience that he had. Now, we talked about this in an earlier video, so I don't want to give the whole thing, but just more in a brief outline. But Mark Twain is young at this time, in his 20s, I believe, and he has a brother who's also young, and he had a vision one night. I woke up, I'd been dreaming, it was extremely vivid, he said. He said, I thought it was real, and he had seen his brother Henry, a corpse. Now, there were a lot of very specific things that he saw in this premonition. It was not just a general feeling like of angst saying, oh no, so I wonder if something happened to my brother. But it was not a normal dream. It was super vivid, number one. Number two, a characteristic such as realer than real, like NDEs that are so vivid. He said stories like this don't change through the years. He said I could just replay it years, decades later because it was so real. Number three, it was about his brother who was healthy, age 20. You wouldn't be expecting him to die. His brother died within a few weeks of the dream. The casket was foreseen to be metallic rather than wooden. There were a lot of other victims. This was an explosion on a boat. And so all the other people that were killed, they were lined up in wooden caskets. His happened to be metallic, was seen in his dream. The casket rested on 2 chairs, not on a table, not on the floor, but on 2 chairs. Henry's corpse wore Twain's clothes, Mark Twain's clothes. An arrangement of white flowers sat on the casket. The arrangement had a red flower in the middle. Now, if you start figuring out odds by multiplying the odd, well, what are the odds that it had, that a corpse would be wearing your clothes instead of that person's clothes that died? What are the odds that it would be resting on 2 chairs? The odds of these, when you multiply them together, are just incredible. So, but what that is somebody else who's not dying, Mark Twain, having a vision about somebody else that was dying who died within a couple of weeks. And how do you explain the odds? Well, atheists don't take this lying down. And so you have people such as Shermer and another fellow that I read who'll say, well, wait a minute. There are people just don't understand the power of numbers. There are billions of people in this world. So if you look closely enough, you're going to find many, many things that are just, the odds seem fantastic. They seem crazy. But you're just look at Ripley's Believe It or Not. You're going to have all kind of weird things happen, just giving the fact that there are so many people having so many dreams. Some of them are going to come true very specifically. Now, my problem with that theory is at least twofold. Number one, it distinguished itself as a super, super vivid dream vision from the very start. Even before his brother died, this was not a normal dream. So you got to say, okay, how many dreams do people have that are like that in their lives, rather than saying, oh, we have a different dream every night and multiply the odds. But secondly, we can go into how prominent those visions are with some further studies that we'll look into. But if I were Mark Twain, what if you were Mark Twain and you had a vision like this? Wouldn't you say, wow, I don't think this was just a natural dream that just happened to be real. So, um, let me give you a couple of other examples. We talked about Jefferson and Adams earlier. Now, there was another fellow during their time, Benjamin Rush. Now, Benjamin Rush was not the type guy who just comes up with crazy things all the time. He's not that crazy uncle, that comes over for Christmas and has wild tales to tell. He was one of the most respected men of his times. He was called in some ways a father of psychiatry. He taught in universities, very respected person. He had a dream one night, Benjamin Rush, and at this point, this was like 17 years before Jefferson and Adams' deaths on the same day, right? So this is 17 years earlier. He has this very vivid dream, and in the dream, he's reading this history book. And what he comes out of it with are a few very specific things. Number one, in the history book that he was dreaming about, Jefferson and Adams renewed their friendship via correspondence. You see, during their presidencies, they were on opposite poles and they had said some things that and done some things that had hurt each other. So they had not been talking or corresponding that much during this time. Benjamin Rush has this dream that they're going to once again renew their correspondence, renew their friendship, and that their correspondence would be so great that it would be sustained over the years and that it would result in a great treasury of wisdom. Now, last week, I think I've still got it here somewhere on my desk, the Adams Jefferson letters. Sure enough, here is the correspondence for these letters. Let me get it upright. The Adams Jefferson letters. Huge. So this actually happened years after the dream. In the end, these gentlemen sunk into the grave nearly at the same time, full of years. Now, that in itself is kind of weird because one was a decade older than the other one. How would you expect them to die at about the same time? It was 17 years later after all this correspondence. So he actually, Benjamin Rush actually wrote Adams about this because it was so powerful. And Adams responded via letter saying, well, it's not really history, it may be prophecy. So he thought so much of it that he wrote them. So obviously, from what we talked about last week, they died on the same day at about the same time. They had renewed this correspondence. Perhaps this was a vision of the future. Let me tell you one from my student. So I'm teaching at Kennesaw State University. My students, where I'm teaching Intro to Religious Studies and also a class on death, dying, and afterlife. And they'll often tell me about their experiences. One said this. Me and my cousin shared a room one night. This is when they were very young. Said we shared a room. It was vivid and so real. I was taken up high in my dream. I saw my cousin covered with darkness as though lifeless. I woke up terrified, gasping for air. While shaking her up and calling her name, suddenly she woke up and the first words she said were so beautiful. I never told her what was wrong as she reached for my trembling hand. I asked what she referred to, thinking she had had a beautiful dream. So she said, well, it's like I knew the place somehow in the dream. Angels led her to paths of gold, brightly colored flowers with distinct scents. So she saw, my student saw this cousin in the dream as though she were dead. She wakes up kind of like in a cold sweat, panting and scared, rustles her friend to make sure she's alive, and sure enough, she is. But at the same time, she had had a dream of great beauty on the other side. The next day, her she left, insisted to see me off at school with an unusually jovial mood. Later that day, she drowned and died in a swimming pool. Now, my friend's concern was, or my student's concern was this some kind of a warning for me, telling me that I should have warned her about something? And she said, I've worried about that. And I said, no, I think often these are things that happen. People will have a premonition of someone's death, very specific, in a very vivid dream, but it's not like they're supposed to do something about it. Somehow it's just, I think, an indication that there's more to life than just the physical body, And for anybody who hears these stories, it just helps them to realize there's more to life, and we need to be seeking spiritual things. So this is pretty powerful. Coming from my students, I hear these things often. They're very common. And then even closer to home, my wife's premonition. I don't remember if I shared this in earlier ones or not, but we had been married about 17 years, and I'm studying these deathbed experiences. And my wife, Sherry, says, "Hey, did I ever tell you about my premonition of my grandmother's death?" And I said, "Well, no." you know, you'd think you'd talk about things like that are so significant as a married couple, but we just don't talk about them in these days. Sherry's a very level headed person. She's been in academia longer than I had at the time. And at Kennesaw State. She's not one to tell tales. I know her, okay? So one night she had this dream, not this is way before we were married, and in the dream she saw her grandmother in a casket, saw the room, the room in which she was, and very vividly woke up kind of like in a cold sweat, that kind of thing. And about a month later, now her grandmother was fine at the time, but about a month later, her mom was diagnosed with breast cancer. It was very large. It had been neglected. And within a few months, she died. When she went to, I don't think I say this in the book, but I asked Sherry later, I said, what was it like when you actually went to the funeral? Said, it was the exact room, much like Mark Twain's. So why do I say that? You don't know me. You don't know Sherry. But you have relatives, you have friends, and these are so common, we found out, that really you need to start collecting these from people that you know and trust. Um,
So,
which
Steve,
brings me to several studies, but go ahead and bring up some questions here.
yeah, so to push back a little bit, what's to say that I guess what's to say that these people just aren't lying and making it up?
Well, again, regarding Mark Twain, it didn't seem to be his style to talk about things that might impress people to get involved in religion because he was not a religious person. I think there's good I'm not it's just hard to imagine him just telling a tall tale like this unless it's something that really happened. Now,
So,
again, we're going to look at the numbers in a little while to make the making it up theory even more or less credible. But that's why I take things like this and start talking to my own relatives that I know and trust. You don't know my wife, Sherry. As far as you know, she might have just gotten out of a mental institution, but
mm-hmm,
I know her.
mm-hmm.
So I trust Sherry. She's not the type to tell me tall tales. So when I bring it into my circles of trust, that takes my trust to a greater level.
So, do you feel that because these phenomena, this particular phenomena of reporting premonitions of others' deaths, do you feel that since that is reported at such a scale that we can actually find studies doing large volumes, that when you within those studies, when you find individual accounts of people who would not align with that belief system, such as the Mark Twain story, you think that those two combined lend credence to be the most powerful argument?
Uh, it lends itself to being one argument that I don't think makes good sense with naturalism.
Okay.
So we're looking at what would naturalism predict? It would predict that we have limits to the things we can know, how far my eyes can see, how far my ears can hear. So if someone is dying in the future, I can't know that. I know that. I know the limitations of my natural senses. And this just would not be predicted in naturalism that somebody could know somebody's death before they die. So, if we can show that these are not just individual events that happened to my wife and to Mark Twain and to my student, but they're broader than that, then maybe we can apply math and say, that's just the math just doesn't say that we can explain
Right.
this by saying there are billions of people. But we'll get to that in a minute.
Okay. Okay.
So, a couple of studies I found. Number one, women were having premonitions of the deaths of their unborn children. Two Swedish studies found that. A Swedish study of 26 mothers of stillborn babies. they just knew, even before they knew from the doctors, that something was wrong. They felt like their baby had died. And a similar study, sudden infant death syndrome. That's
Mm.
not something that you see coming on. It's just all of a sudden you've got this child who died for seemingly no reason. And yet a group documented this one study, Southwest SIDS research group documented 21% of parents had a premonition of the infant's subsequent death. That's 21% of the people whose child died of SIDS that had a premonition of it. Now, they also had a retrospective control group to say, hey, maybe all parents are having premonitions that their children have died. But they took people whose parents had whose children had not died, and only 3% of those had had a feeling like their child was going to die. So
Oh, okay. So
21% versus 3, that was a good retrospective study to do to try to get at that.
so the
But then
21% had said that after they had lost a child, that they would reflect on that and say, okay, yeah, I had a premonition that I was going to lose the child, versus they're saying, okay, let's go ask healthy parents if this is just like, maybe it's some kind of like parental fear that's being
right,
stoked
right, right.
amongst, an equal percentile of the population of parents. And they found that it's actually 3%, only 3% maybe had like this paranoia type thing of their children were going to pass along.
That's true.
Mm.
So, but we're trying to take a cumulative case
No,
just
I
for this
understand.
one line of
Yeah.
argument,
Yeah.
and that's our start. Is that there are some studies showing that it seems like parents sometimes know things that are actually going to happen in the future. Now, when we get into the big numbers, these studies were done in the late 1800s, and Charlie's probably going to push back and say, "Now, wait a minute, late 1800s. Why are you going back that far?" I would say that these studies had been done on such a scale with such care that it's likely these will never be done to this extent again. If they will be, that'll be fine. But these studies were done by exceptionally qualified people among huge groups of people. And I want to tell a little about them because they bring numbers into it, and I think specifically help us when dealing with people like Shermer who say, "Oh, there are billions of people out here. You can just explain it away by numbers." So, mid 1880s, some researchers surveyed 5,705 people. This was a study called Phantasms of the Living. It was
Mm.
reported in a 2-volume work, Phantasms of the Living, which I got and read through, co-researched and written by Edmund Gurney, Frederick Myers, and Frank Podmore. Now, these are people, the first two were fellows of Trinity College, Cambridge. Frank Podmore was from Oxford. So these are two of the most prestigious universities, both at their time and ours, and they're surveying people in their area. Now, why is that significant? David Hume, a century earlier, had been arguing that all these reports of miracles and people knowing things they shouldn't have known and visions, these all come from pre scientific times, ignorant countries, pre science, whatever, and so we can't trust them. Well, these are surveys being done in some of the most highly educated, advanced places in the world, right? Around Oxford and Cambridge, and by very much top researchers. Now, they also enlisted a professor of economics at Harvard, Dr. Edgeworth, who was a pioneer in statistical analysis to analyze these things. So what they found was they surveyed all these people, over 5,000 people, asking them this: since January 1st, have you ever had a dream of the death of a person known to you, which dream you marked as an exceptionally vivid one, and of which the distressing impression lasted for as long as an hour after you rose in the morning? Most dreams we just forget,
Mm-hmm.
but this one lasted. And and it was a dream of a death of someone you know. 1 out of 26 of the respondents said yes. And of these, the largest category was an apparition. Okay, actually seeing something. This is empirical, right? Seeing something, an apparition warning the experiencer of impending danger or a crisis, the majority of which pointed to someone's death. So they said, let's just take the ones to where it happened within 24 hours, 12 hours before the vision or 12 hours after the vision, within a day, and see what we come up with. And let's compare it with actuarial charts of what are the odds that a person is going to die in any given day. So what they found was 396 times as many cases where a person accurately predicted a death as should have been the case if it were merely subjective and an accidental coincidence. Like, I may have a dream that somebody died, and it just happens that, wow, they died on the same day. Well, that's really cool. But Sherman's right. Billions of people in the world. Maybe I'm just the one that happened to get one that that turned out right. But when you survey a specific number of people, then you can say, okay, the odds of some of more than one within this group getting it within 24 hours, wow, that's getting pretty slim. Then if there are 3 out of that, if there are 4 out of that, but when there are 396 times as many cases as you would expect, then these are terrible odds that it was just happenstance. You should not have that many in a group that large. Now, I would say that 396 times is not a wild, outrageous estimate. That's an extremely conservative estimate because think of it, people like Mark Twain's vision, people like Sherry's vision, they would have been thrown out of that mix because it wasn't within a 24-hour period. And yet all those within that group that were outside of the 24-hour period, still, that would be great evidence that it's not by chance, but they didn't include those. They tried to be extremely careful not to include anything that would be going overboard, but be extremely conservative with the evidence. Now, I would encourage those that are thinking about these things to go to a library or somewhere and find these volumes. It's a 2-volume report, over 1,000 pages in it, Phantasms of the Living, volumes 1 and 2. And what you have to do is to read each case. Think about it. What are the odds, that something like this could have happened? And when you start looking at the specific cases, you'll have someone in another country who dies. Somebody over here in this country had a nighttime vision that person had died. They didn't even know the person had been sick. They had not been in touch with them at all. Of course, you're not flying back and forth or calling back and forth in the late 1800s. You're getting letters weeks later. And then many of them would actually write down the date that it happened because they were so convinced this person had died. And then they get a letter saying, wow, on that same date, this person died. Now, it's not astounding that they just surveyed this many people, but once they saw people claiming this had happened, they got with the people. They actually talked to them face to face. They looked for corroborating evidence that this had happened, like they would look for newspaper reports saying that actually happened on that day. And they really examined this carefully. And if you look at somebody like William James at Harvard at the time, who was also involved with the next study we'll talk about. William James was one of the top intellects that this country's ever produced. He was teaching at Harvard. That guy studied medicine. He taught anatomy at Harvard. Then he got involved in psychology and became known as the father of modern psychology, taught psychology at Harvard. Also studied philosophy, taught philosophy at Harvard. This is one of the most diverse, respected intellects ever. This is what he said about the phantasm study. He said, this is a most extraordinary work, 1,400 large and closely printed pages by men of the rarest intellectual qualifications. In any reputable department of science, the qualities displayed in these volumes would be reckoned superlatively good. That's William James's comments on this. Now, read that. I mean, go back, read it. I think this is a very well done study by capable people. This was not coming out of a seminary where people are arguing for Jesus being true or anything. They're very capable, but they were concerned that materialism in the late 1800s was becoming such a big thing in academia, and they thought, it would be interesting to follow up on some experiences that seem to contradict materialism and naturalism, and I think they did a great job of it.
Yeah,
Now, they considered this a preliminary study, which was setting them up for an even larger study. But what would you say? Would you have any comebacks to these, Charlie, or comments as to that I'm missing out on?
well,
By the way, in my book, I put a lot of pages
yeah,
into this
yeah, a lot of
to
footnotes.
help us try to understand who these people are, why we should trust them, that type thing in the research.
Yeah, while you're talking about this, the thought that kind of keeps playing over and over in my head is just because I feel like the philosophical basis for saying it's just coincidence, there seems like there's some kind of like logical fallacy floating around in there in terms of it. If I say 1 in 100 people are going to see an apparition of someone they love die shortly before they die, right? And then I just say, but it's 1 in 100 people, so it's not really that crazy because it's coincidence. I feel like that still doesn't really do a great job in terms of providing explanatory power as to why the phenomenon is happening at all.
Okay, take the girl from my class. She Put yourself in her shoes. I don't think there was a good reason for her to lie. She's not writing a book about it. She's
Sure.
not trying. I did ask her permission to be able to share it with people, and she gave me that permission, which I appreciate. But you don't tend to talk to people about that. Number one, especially your professor. They're
Hmm.
not. My class is not that hard. They're not just trying to get a good grade by sharing something I think may think is cool. In fact, she may think that I think she's crazy. So why would you share it? But think from her perspective. Um, she's spending the night with this relative, has this vision of the relative's death. The relative has a vision of the other side during that same night. The next day, she drowns. What are you going to make of that? Are you going to say, well, there are billions of people in the world. I'm just the lucky one that did it? No, I don't think you're going to say that. You're going to say, okay, but why did it happen to me? This, you just can't ignore something like that, right? And maybe it does happen to a lot of people, you might say in your mind. I
But
just don't know what the percentages are, but that in itself, the fact that it happened once to Mark Twain, even if he was the only one, does seem rather significant to me. Doesn't it to you?
yeah, absolutely. And I guess that's like what I'm trying to say is when I look at, you quote Shermer, I think at the beginning of this chapter, or not Shermer. Is it Shermer at the beginning of the chapter? Who's the atheist you quote at
Uh,
the beginning of the chapter?
no, that was Bertrand Russell.
Bertrand Russell. Sorry, yeah, Bertrand Russell. So he's essentially trying to say that if you understand numbers and the potentiality of coincidence, that you could essentially chalk anything up to randomness, right? Right?
That's not what Russell's saying.
Okay, okay.
That's what Shermer's saying, and one other fellow, I forgot who it was. I got his book up here somewhere. But both Shermer and this other fellow quoted, I think it's Worley. He wrote a book called Mortal Minds. So Worley's an atheist. He's saying all this is just, but both of them quote the Mark Twain example. They don't question that it really happened to Mark Twain. They're just saying big numbers explain it away. Now,
But
by contrary, Russell is really kind of agreeing with us in that he's saying he's an atheist, but somebody asked him, what kind of evidence would convince you that God exists? He says, I think if I heard a voice, now this is not getting a great number of people. He's just saying if it happened to me, right? He said, I think if I heard a voice from the sky predicting all that was going to happen to me during the next 24 hours, including events that would have seemed highly improbable, and if all these events um, then proceed to happen, then I might perhaps be convinced at least of the existence of some superhuman intelligence. I can imagine other evidence of the same sort which might convince me, but as far as I know, no such evidence exists. And I said it's very interesting that he was studying Bertrand Russell was studying at Cambridge as a young person at the same time that these people were um, doing their huge surveys regarding apparitions.
Mm-hmm.
But go ahead. So,
Well,
so to clarify, yes,
yeah. I guess I'm just saying, it's like, even if you could, let me be concise, and maybe this would help. Even if you could chalk it up to 1 in 100, or 1 in 1,000, or 1 in 1,000,000, it still doesn't explain why the phenomenon is happening. 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000,000, one. And like, I agree with you where you're saying that even if Mark Twain was the only one we had, there would still be merit to Mark Twain's account.
yes. Yes, so I think there are merits to the individual accounts, which is why we talk about the individual accounts. But what's happening is we're tightening this noose around naturalism's neck by saying, okay, maybe the billions of people, maybe it's 1 in 1 billion. Yes, weird thing. Okay, I agree. Weird things happen sometimes. If we can get an incidence of these and it's actually happening to millions of people,
Right, a pattern.
not just Mark Twain,
Yeah.
we've got millions of witnesses lining up saying, "It happened to me." Outside the courtroom, this line is extending way far out when you put millions of people saying this, which is what you get into when you start saying, 4% or whatever of the population having these.
Oh, okay. So that's what I was going to ask you. I was going to say, is that, like, do you have a flat number that could be applied to the general population?
A study has been done several times in American history as to how many people have seen someone that was not physically in their presence. Okay, it's like an apparition, right?
Mm-hmm.
It generally hovers around 10% of the population. And then again, this has been done over and over until recent times. Now, the largest category, and I think I figured this out one time, but the largest subcategory under that 10% are people who had a crisis apparition or they saw somebody who had just died. It seems that 4% comes to mind, but I need to look that up more clearly to see if they actually got a percentage on that. But that's significant, whatever the number is. If it were just 1%, you know, that is a large number when you're talking about the population of the United States or talking about the population of the world.
And you're saying, so are you saying 4% of the 10%? Are you saying that 10% reported seeing an
No, no, no,
apparition?
4% of everybody.
Okay. So four of that 10%. Okay. Sorry, I'm
Out
trying to
of
phrase
out of
that.
the
Yeah.
10%, out
Yeah.
of the yeah, 10% of the population as opposed to 4% of the entire population.
Okay. That's, there we go. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an important thing. We miss that
Yeah.
on things often. Thanks
Yeah.
for clarifying.
Mhm.
So, so maybe we could move on and at least start. Let's see how our time's going.
We got a little bit more time.
Uh,
Let's go. Let's go
well,
into
at
the next
least we
one.
can at least we can get into this study. So
Yeah,
they
I'm gonna try.
consider that a preliminary study, believe it or not. That is so much better than so many of the psychological studies I see done today. Huge number of people surveyed, huge number of people individually interviewed, uh, comparing that to other corroborating data.
Well,
So,
actually, Steve, hold on. Before we move on, I think you do ask a
okay.
really good question, and I'm curious to get. I know people in the audience would want to know if this seemed to be such a big deal, right? With phantasms of the living, like you mentioned, that happens at the late 1800s. What do you
Mhm.
think? What do you think causes the research on this particular phenomenon to kind of just start to drop off? Like, what do you think that is?
Well, I think number one, between the two studies, the one we just mentioned and the one we're going to talk about, I think they were so well done and you actually had it replicated. People were saying, well, we don't have millions of dollars to replicate this thing or that would be a huge thing. I think they've made their point. So I think a lot of people would say they made their point. Now, they weren't really arguing all the way to the afterlife. All they said was, we can't explain this away by chance.
Hmm.
Now, why wouldn't they go further than that? Because a lot of people at their time felt that there was sufficient scientific evidence that people could communicate mind to mind in some ways. Like that, people with cards over here and somebody that's a good mind reader could say, "Oh, you're holding up a four of spades." And they thought there was enough evidence that people were able to do that kind of thing at a distance. Uh, since that was true, one of the hypotheses to explain these studies would be, okay, that wasn't really a person after death showing themselves to that person. Before death, that person wanted to send a communication to somebody and sent it before they died, and it reached them going mind to mind. So we can't say for sure this is giving us evidence of an afterlife.
Wait,
Now,
so they thought that you could just chalk it up to basically telepathy and then you would just move on with everything?
what I'm saying is that not necessarily that these researchers thought that.
Mm.
They just thought that this is a possible hypothesis that a lot of people are going to throw at them if they start saying we just proved the afterlife. So they limited their conclusion to say chance can't explain this. It's got to be something else besides chance to show how did these people know of someone's death within a 24-hour period? How did they see them? It was going to take more study for people to go in and eliminate this hypothesis that maybe they were sending a message before they were dead that reached the person. Now, to me, some of these actually wrote some articles later and said, this really, you really need to apply Occam's razor and say you're getting way out on a limb when you try to bring in this hypothesis. Because, okay, some people are, it's like 12 hours after they died that the person got the message. So what happened? Well, was the person distracted and unable to receive the
Oh, they were
message?
just further
And
away.
so they were further. It takes a while for those apparitions to make it over the Atlantic Ocean when it's that far away.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so
Speed
they're
of
they're
sound.
thinking about it and they're saying, this is
Mm.
really not that good a hypothesis. But I really respect the people for saying, let's just limit our for sure conclusion. Because these were people who didn't really come to conclusions very quickly. They needed tons of evidence to come up with anything. So they said, okay, here's something we know for sure. This was not chance.
Hmm.
And they just left it at that. So for somebody else to come back and replicate it and say, okay, they've already shown that, that's fine. But let me give another hypothesis as to how it happened. They could have gone more in that direction. So the second thing I would say, second reason is science began many scientists became so materialistic in their orientation that they felt like science just doesn't study this type of stuff. Scientists study material
Yeah.
things
It
with
gets
material effects.
confined.
Scientists don't study, and psychology was caught up in this too. Even though psychology wasn't a hard science, they wanted to be a hard science desperately. So they'd say, no, 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 we can't. If you're doing your PhD or you're working in a university, don't go off and study this kind of stuff because it's not going to get published. People don't like that. You're not looked up at. And peer pressure, I'm sorry, is a big thing in academia. And so people just this kind of began to be things that were just discussed in paranormal type journals rather than scientific journals. What's happened in the last 20 years is once again, these type things are getting into the regular scientific journals because of the study done on near death experiences. So I think in retrospect, these are pretty powerful studies that people need to dredge back up and add them to all the studies that are showing that near death experiences are something showing a separation of mind and brain, dualism, and all this. These studies need to be put back in the mix
I
because they
could
were done such a quality way.
I can see the article now, Steve, how when near death or the when the afterlife was competing with telepathy, that's going to get so many people to be interested cuz they'll be like, "What?"
Yeah, it's like today, far less people are going to believe in and it's not just a telepathy you'd have to believe in. They had a phrase for it, but it'd be like super visual telepathy. I mean,
Mm,
when people
yeah.
today are
Yeah.
saying doing the card tricks and saying
Right.
they'll find, oh, well, you know, 55% of them actually came up with something where it should have just been 50% or 60%, right? But they didn't actually see the cards in a certain vivid way in their mind. The cards didn't come visit them in a dream. This is very different than the type of telepathy we're talking about when people discuss it today. So really, you don't have that competing hypothesis today. And again, I think that's a good reason that people ought to go back and re-examine these studies.
All right, so Steve, we got a little bit. We got about 10 minutes left. So let's work into line of evidence 4, and see where we're at.
Okay, so I'm sorry. What number are we on
We're
now?
on number 4. So if DBEs are either
We're on number
normal,
4. Okay, so let's. Okay, so the second study I'm calling the British census, and this one was done at the with the approval and commissioned by the International Congress of Experimental Psychology in Paris in 1889. It was entrusted to Professor Sidgwick's direction. Henry Sidgwick was over this. He was an extremely well respected professor at Cambridge University. Here's, in fact, look at this book, Henry Sidgwick, Eye of the Universe, an intellectual biography. You know when this was written? This was written after the year 2000. I think it was 2004 by some scholars, I believe, at the University of Chicago. It's Cambridge University Press. Charlie, if people are writing intellectual biographies on us 100 years after what we're doing, we will have succeeded. What I'm saying is Henry Sidgwick is extremely respected in academic history for his writings on moral philosophy. He taught in several different areas. He and his wife, and they were both just extremely careful researchers. Her wife was involved. His wife was involved with some of the cutting edge scientific research of the time. She was especially good at mathematics and helping scientists with their math. They were both intimately involved with this study. The others, just top level academics. And I think William James actually participated with it on the American side. So again, you're surveying people around Oxford and Cambridge and Harvard universities. William James is involved in it at this point, and just top scholars. They came up with basically the same thing as the original study, only a little more dramatic. They surveyed 17,000 people. 13% of them answered yes to the question, which they worded a little bit differently, but question of whether or not they'd experienced visions of people while awake. Again, the largest category were these crisis apparitions, and so they determined that there were 440 times as many of these visions that happened within a 24-hour period as would be expected according to naturalistic chance. And if you get into the specifics that where they were interviewing people, I mean, often this is actually Henry Sidgwick, one of the top intellectuals who's ever lived, interviewing these people. It's incredible. So the committee would receive letters on November 17th. Mr. Anderson went to bed around 8:30. They actually give the names. Unlike many of the studies today where they don't give any names, you could follow up with these people at the time if you wanted to. This person went to bed, woke in the middle of the night to the sight of his aunt, aunt, standing with her arms down near the foot of the bed at one side, dressed in an ordinary black dress, looked older and stouter than when he had seen her 3 years before. He, it was like she was saying goodbye, then the figure gradually vanished. He was convinced that he was fully awake. He was not anxious about her, having no letters to say that she was seriously ill, although he knew she was not very well. She used to write to them once every 2 months. He told his wife the next morning, I've seen our aunt. who said goodbye. I am sure she is dead. We'll take note. So he put down on a piece of paper, I believe Aunt P died on the 17th, and put the paper in a drawer. His wife made a note of it herself in a diary that she kept. After the letter arrived in December announcing the aunt's death, she referred to the diary and found it confirmed their recollection as to the coincidence of dates. Mrs.
So
Anderson, they said, hey, let's talk to her about it. Make sure her story just is like lawyers, right? Dealing with witnesses. She said, Mrs. Anderson said, I remember perfectly well my husband telling me of the apparition of his aunt. And the apparition was within a few hours of the time of death. So, what you read when you read this study that was published in a journal, it was hundreds of pages long. You read story after story of these people that seemed like trustworthy people with no motive to lie. They weren't getting published, and it's really pretty powerful stuff as it accumulates.
so we never introduced that line of evidence though. In terms of
I'm
like
sorry, we're still on the past line of evidence. We're
right.
just in the second study that was on naturalism indicates. This is line of evidence number 3. Naturalism indicates that people should not be able to have accurate premonitions of the deaths of others. There were 2 studies confirming that. There was a preliminary study, and then there was the second study that the Sidgwicks were involved with. And that we're just finishing up that line of evidence.
Okay. That was my bad. I
I
changed
can't
that up
ever
on you.
remember numbers, so when you mentioned the number of the line of evidence, I didn't remember
All right,
what the number was.
we're gonna go ahead and just wrap up with that then today because we're not gonna have enough time to jump into line of evidence number 4, which would be if DBEs are either normal dreams or hallucinations, then why are the dying often surprised to see people on the other side who are not known to have died? That is where we will pick up next week, ladies and gentlemen. Just because, again, I want to make sure we have enough time to jump into this one. I thought we might be able to sneak it in on the back end of this episode, but like Steve said, there was he's dedicated. I don't even know if you have a total page count, Steve, to how many pages you dedicated to this one, the line of evidence number 3. It definitely, I think that's the one you spilled the most amount of ink on, right?
I spilt lots of ink.
Yeah.
And the reason is I want to be careful. What we're trying to do is to build a foundation for afterlife apologetics. And people are going to come in. And so what I do is I document the stuff. I have it. Look at these pages. These pages are
Yeah, that's
just
just your footnotes.
footnotes. That's just footnotes trying to show people who responded to these studies. I want to lay a track for others in the future to be able to come back and look at to see how I did with my evidence.
Yeah, I remember seeing that the first time and just being like, "What? Did they just mess up this printing or something?" Like, I was like, "Oh no, that's all footnotes." Okay.
Sherry must have not seen Steve for those 2 months when he was doing all those footnotes. Oh
just
my goodness.
just a big line of them. But you're right. There was a lot of substantial dialogue had around this phenomenon, and it's almost a little bit of a tragedy that it happens in a time frame where things like, to me, there's just so much there in terms of telepathy is a competing hypothesis for explaining away these events. I feel like that's a great clue as to kind of the general landscape of what this study was being conducted in. And it would be interesting to see if, just a hypothetical, if this was recreated in the modern day landscape, how would it be received? What would be the competing hypotheses to explain away the phenomena, that kind of thing. It would be definitely interesting to see this study done in modern day scientific landscape to see how, if at all, I mean, it may have no different impact at all. But I'm just curious about those social factors influencing how the evidence is looked at and then how it's interpreted into popular culture.
And perhaps if we can get this afterlife apologetics off the ground, future researchers will say, wow, let's replicate that in modern times and see what we get.
Yeah.
Was it just because people back then tended to believe in these things? Well, it's a very materialistic time. Is it different today? In what way? And again, some of these studies have been done as far as seeing what percentage of the population has seen someone who is not physically there. They just not gone into the depth of examining them the way they did and using statistics.
Well, and near-death experiences seem to have gotten a lot more of the spotlight in terms of what's being studied and written about and drawn attention to, versus deathbed experiences and things like that tend to have. It seems like you have to go a little bit further back to find more evidence on that, or am I wrong with that, Steve?
Well, it's creeping up on us again because of the New York hospice, particularly where they've been studying people who are dying, interviewing them each day, and finding out that these deathbed visions are so common. So that gets us back into deathbed stuff, not just near death experiences, but deathbed experiences. So hopefully we'll see this blossom as well over time into deathbed experiences, expanding us beyond the near death experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right, awesome. Well, that was fun. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. We're going to pick it up next week. I know we got to spend a lot of time today focused on one particular one, and it flew by for us. I hope you guys enjoyed it just as much as we did. Hey, huge favor. If you guys are still watching the show at the point, which is a monumental task, thank you so much for staying this long. Do me a massive favor. Please send this podcast to someone that you think it would be of benefit to. All right. Someone who may be interested in the conversation, or maybe interested in the evidence, or maybe even want to push back on us. And you're like, man, I'd love if this person went and had a conversation with Steve and Charlie. Absolutely. Bring them in here. Let them comment on the videos. And then we'll, like I said, we're going to get back to engaging with some of the comments that come in, because we absolutely want to engage with those questions. But we also got to spend some time walking out some of our core content, some of our core material, which is going to be these lines of evidence for deathbed experiences and near-death experiences. So we will get back to that. But again, if you find value on this show, a massive favor to us would be subscribe if you haven't subscribed, like the video if you haven't liked the video. If you've done both of those, then just please send the video to someone that you think would get as much benefit out of it as you have. And in the interim, we'll see you guys next week for the next episode. And God bless. We'll see you guys on the other side.